Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 241, John Pope or Ambrose Burnside. Last week, we talked about Joe Shelby and his 1863 raid. While maybe questionable in terms of how effective that raid truly was, I think it was still important to talk about another of the more notable raids during the war, especially given the fact that we actually skipped over it in our main narrative. This week, we take a little bit different of an approach. We're going to talk about two controversial figures of the war that have different kind of reputations. We begin by comparing two leaders of the Federal armies in the East, in Pope and Burnside. Before we do that, though, of course, let's talk about our Patreon content. And we have a couple of items here that are posted. Most recently, we did a little bit of a different episode we actually had in conjunction with the month of April and Appomattox. We actually had a picture slideshow and we read off Edward Porter Alexander's account of the surrender and the events that actually led to the surrender, and we had a couple of pictures not only of the site there at Appomattox but also at the breakthrough as well, so we kind of paired those two together. It's not something that we've actually done before, so hopefully that you all found that to be interesting. We've done movie reviews. We're going to go back to memoir reviews and talk about some POWs here in the future. That is next on our list of things to do. And believe it or not, we still have some movies to do, some pretty big name movies as well that we are going to also have here on the schedule. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. When you think about the individuals who are to blame, maybe, for some of the early defeats of the Army of Potomac and the Army of Virginia, as well we should say, there are probably two names that really come to mind. In my experience, Pope is kind of an afterthought sometimes, just sort of a placeholder, and Ambrose Burnside often unfairly gets the moniker of being an incompetent general. In a high-level view, why is that? Part of this is the disaster which both of them preside over respectively. I often throw out that Second Manassas could have been Lee's greatest victory, Chancellorsville aside, because he was facing longer odds there. Fredericksburg is a one-sided affair, so while at the end of the day the strategic situation changes very little, in other words, nothing being gained by the rebels, it is seen as kind of unnecessary overall. But the fact remains that there is a generally low opinion of the commanding officers of the army probably until you get to Meade, and then even then, you kind of lack the sense that if he had been commanding the army prior, it's not like there would have been a whole lot that would have changed. Like maybe if the roles had been slightly different and the order had been slightly different, maybe Meade too would have been shipped off to, say, Minnesota, had not everything happened at the right time and had there not been such an important battle as Gettysburg that happened for him. But even so, we usually have a redeeming factor for the individuals who are leading the primary field armies. McDowell is new to command, and his plan is complicated, so he kind of gets a pass, especially considering that the situation could very well have folded very differently, and First Manassas could very well have been a Union victory. Could you imagine having a large McDowell statue in Washington, D.C.? Maybe President McDowell even. Maybe President McClellan even. We have talked in depth before about Little Mac, but there are usually enough positive characteristics that keep him afloat as not the worst. Pope we will talk about, but he is not doing anyone any favors by being a very much aligned political general, this being part of the thought process of maybe we need somebody who is more down for the cause, so to speak. Burnside has a career outside of being the commanding general of the army, which we will also discuss. Hooker has a decent plan, and honestly, usually he is given a pass of being at the mercy of Lee and Jackson, or at least maybe a victim of their genius, which I at least find rather odd considering you could say the same thing for Pope. Although, for Pope, it's almost as if he doesn't do as good of a job in blaming people. Hooker does have his big three that he blames for the Battle of Chancellorsville, whereas Pope definitely has his scapegoats as well, and maybe perhaps his are a little bit more sympathetic than, say, a George Stoneman, right? But we will talk about that here when we get to Second Manassas and Pope. This might be a bit of a stretch, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that Fighting Joe could have done a good job at Gettysburg. Now, an argument to that, though, for the overall Union strategy, the overall way that everything rolls out there at Gettysburg for the Union and for Meade, is that kind of actually part of the positive is that Meade is new to Army Command, and so acting defensively is kind of in his best interest because he's kind of putting all the pieces together on the fly. And if you have somebody like Fighting Joe Hooker, who already kind of is familiar with everything and knows where everything is, like we have that famous example where Meade is taking over on the march to Gettysburg, and he doesn't know where everybody is, right? And he's asking Joe Hooker, like, do you know where everyone is, right? And that's kind of like an alarming thing when he's like, I don't even know, where all the pieces of this thing that I'm supposed to be taking over even are, right? So when you are actually then confronted with kind of this climactic battle, this battle that you know is going to be important because everyone is writing about how important it is, and then you're like, man, I don't know if I'm confident to act in an aggressive way, whereas Hooker might have been a little bit more aggressive than, say, Meade. Is he going to act the same way? Maybe, maybe not, right? But I don't think it's necessarily a foregone conclusion that Hooker is going to have Chancellorsville happen to him again at Gettysburg. Much like Burnside, Hooker has a good career prior to taking the reins. Unlike Ambrose, though, he benefits from being the recipient of attack, a well-executed flanking march, whereas the battle plan for Fredericksburg on the surface is pretty dicey. We should also consider that Hooker is able to get the army back into a situation where morale is decently high, and there is not much gained by the rebels. We have talked Meade before, and how Gettysburg is sort of the best thing to happen for him as a general because he has a pretty simple tactical situation. We just talked about that. And how he is dealing with an offensive on 3 straight days. Even though it was a close-run thing, and certainly he does a good job of staving off the rebels, so we should not discount him, he's going to ride this success all the way to the end of the war. So in this gallery, there are really 2 individuals then that we can say have a reputation as being a quote-unquote bad general, fairly or unfairly, as we are going to discuss, and those are going to be Pope and Burnside. And they are going to be the subject matter of today, and hopefully we can come to a better conclusion, and maybe decide if those are fair or unfair, who is the better or the worse general. I'm going to try to do my best to lay out the facts for you, and kind of give everyone a rundown of everything, and their careers, their tenures. We're really focused just on their tenures of kind of at the reins here in the East, and obviously for Pope it's going to be Second Manassas, and obviously for Burnside, it's going to be Fredericksburg. And we're going to really kind of hone in on those situations for both those generals and kind of let you make your own opinion. And then in our sub-episode, I'll kind of give you my spin, my take on it. And we'll go ahead and begin and just refamiliarize ourselves with these generals and where their backgrounds and where they're coming from. John Pope was born in Kentucky in 1822. He would attend the U.S. Military Academy, graduating and becoming a topographical engineer. Remember that if you're a topographical engineer, that means you did a really good job at West Point. There's a lot of math involved with that, right? Serving in Florida and Mexico, he would spend the immediate lead up to the war on various engineering projects, including mapping out a railroad route to the Pacific. He was one of the Army officers to accompany Lincoln in his trip to Washington, as his Kentucky roots had him seeing connections to the Lincoln family. As such, he would be sent to Illinois to train volunteers. Seeing brief action in Missouri, he would be given the Army of Mississippi in 1862 and given the task to clear the river. Remember that the river and opening that up for commercial traffic was a big goal for the Lincoln administration. It was part of the overall plan and a good propaganda piece. Island number 10 would be a target of his army, using the Navy to assist in rendering the Confederate position untenable, and would see the surrender of 7,000 troops. Now, there are those who point to the fact that John P. McClellan, the Confederate commander there, is really going to be dropping the ball during this campaign, which leads to the loss with minimal casualties, but still a pretty big victory for the Union cause. Following this, Pope is going to see himself shipped to the east, commanding the newly formed Army of Virginia. Now, during this Island number 10 operation, there are going to be a lot of warning signs already that we can kind of go ahead and start to roll out here. He is going to operate with the Navy. He's not going to work well with the Navy. There are going to be those who do not like him, right? So that's going to be a problem. He is facing a far inferior force, and there are those who point to the fact that the rebels don't really offer him a true battle in this situation. Island number 10 is kind of a weird campaign in that there is no climactic battle, and so he's going to have a very low opinion of the Confederates rolling into the east, and that's going to be a problem, as we're going to see, right? Burnside was born in Indiana in 1824. He would attend the U.S. Military Academy, after which he would see action in the war with Mexico. Leaving the Army and settling in Rhode Island, he would design a carbine and attempt to sell it to the Army. Although he is sort of screwed over by John Floyd, who takes a different contract, Ambrose is then going to find employment with George B. McClellan, who at this point was a railroad man, and this is going to spark a friendship between the two. Once the war broke out, Burnside would command a brigade of Rhode Island troops, commanding them in the first major action of the war. Burnside's brigade was one of the units which performed well, especially in the initial stages of the fight on Matthews Hill, if you recall. He would be able to parlay this and his friendship with McClellan into the expedition into North Carolina. He would do well in capturing the coast of that state, securing some early victories for the Union cause. McClellan would call on his troops to form the Ninth Corps of the Army, a unit he will command essentially throughout the war. Joining the Eastern Theater in earnest for the Antietam campaign, he would sing wing command during that battle, where famously he oversees the section of the battlefield with a bridge that bears his name. One day, I really hope to maybe do, and this could be a sub-episode, just kind of talk about the Ninth Corps, because I do think it's an interesting subject. It is probably the most well-traveled corps, right? You have it starting there in the coast and having, Roanoke Island. That's a very important early action for the Union cause. Then you have them popping up and participating not only in Second Manassas, which we're about to talk about with Pope, but we're also Antietam, of course. And Antietam at Burnside's Bridge, they're going to be bearing the brunt of that action there on the lower end of the battlefield. And then, of course, we're going to be shifted into the Ohio Department and then spend some time not only there, right? Knoxville, of course. And then in the Meridian campaign, then they get all the way out there. So Mississippi, right? And then back into Ohio. And then they get shipped back into the east for the overland campaign throughout to the end of the war, right? So it's kind of an interesting career of a well-traveled corps there, and participates in a lot of battles. And obviously in the overland campaign, you're participating in a lot of major actions there, and especially even when you get into Petersburg as well, right? The crater, of course, that's going to be the Ninth Corps as well. So interesting unit, and maybe worth talking about, and just kind of maybe briefly listing off kind of where they went, and kind of maybe even giving a little mileage count as well. I think that might be interesting to see. Once taking over in Virginia, Pope would launch a harder war, especially in the face of the Southern populace. This would be welcomed by Stanton and Lincoln, who had been tired of McClellan and his more lenient policies. Really, Pope and the Army are victims of the mentality that as long as it is different than the young Napoleon, then it is okay. Remember his famous circular to the army, which I have here to drive home the point. Let us understand each other. I have come from the West, where we have always seen the backs of our enemies, from an army whose business it has been to seek the adversary and to beat him where he was found, whose policy has been attack and not defense. In but one instance has the enemy been able to place our Western armies in defensive attitude. I presume that I have been called here to pursue the same system and to lead you against the enemy. It is my purpose to do so, and that speedily. I am sure you long for an opportunity to win the distinction you are capable of achieving. That opportunity I shall endeavor to give you. Meantime, I desire you to dismiss from your mind certain phrases which I am sorry to find much in vogue amongst you. I hear constantly of taking strong position and holding them, of lines of retreat, and of bases of supply. Let us discard such ideas. The strongest position a soldier should desire to occupy is the one from which he can most easily advance against the enemy. Let us study the probable lines of retreat of our opponents and leave our own to take care of themselves. Let us look before us and not behind. Success and glory are all in the advance. Disaster and shame lurk in the rear. Let us act on this understanding, and it is safe to predict that your banners shall be inscribed with many a glorious deed, and that your names will dear your countrymen forever. So obviously, right, it's kind of a slap in the face to everyone, sort of. But also, it's interesting to kind of have this sort of mentality, this attitude. It's exactly kind of the wrong idea of how eventually the overland campaign that we just mentioned rolls out in the end, right? You need to have these bases of supply. You need to be able to have lines of retreat. Eventually, the war gets to the point where you're not assaulting the enemy over open ground. You're going to have these positions. It whittles down all the way to that. And you have this kind of mentality here. And this is a very 1862 mentality. It's a very kind of antiquated mentality in 1864 terms, right? So it is good to kind of read this off and get an idea of where his mind is at as we roll into Second Manassas. On paper, Pope might have been a good choice to lead. He was going to push on Gordonsville and try to take pressure away from McClellan while his army is sent to join him. Severing the railroad link to Richmond from the west should be a decent goal. Acting aggressively, he would send Nathaniel Banks and his corps to the south to engage the Confederates, but Jackson and his command would check him at Cedar Mountain, winning a victory that might have ended poorly for the Southerners had there not been a rally at a key point. From there, the campaign essentially unravels. Pope is stunned enough to sort of fall back and not act. Stuart and Jackson would both have famous raids into the supply of the army operating around Bristow Station while waiting for McClellan to shift his forces. We might forgive Pope for waiting until he could be reinforced, as he is facing a far more formidable foe than 7,000 boxed-in Confederates under John McCowan. McClellan is going to drag his feet and not begin to transfer the troops from the peninsula until the middle of August, whereas perhaps there would have been the full complement had he acted faster. As it was, Pope would set about trying to bring Jackson to heel, Jackson having marched around the Union Army, Longstreet checking the command. In terms of the tactical options available for John Pope, we can understand he wanted to eliminate Jackson operating along the line of supply. However, Longstreet and the other half of the army might have been pressured, this being an option on the table. Pope will know that Jackson is at Manassas Junction, the rebel leader having raided there. He would wish to concentrate his command and overwhelm the smaller Southern corps. Not a bad idea. However, Pope is going to seemingly just think Jackson will remain there and let him carefully formulate an attack plan. Stonewall will famously pull into the railroad cut, hitting the Federal moving column at the Bronner Farm. On August 29th, the battle would continue with general Federal assaults along Jackson's line. The Confederates will hang on, there being a brief breakthrough that needs to be responded near A.P. Hill's command. The attacks on Jackson are not really what is subpar on the part of Pope. Continually, he is operating at an intelligence deficiency as to where the enemy is and what the strength is. Famously, we have the orders that send Porter and the 5th Corps, along with McDowell, marching on the Confederate right flank. He is going to run into cavalry, and reports will arrive that Longstreet is moving through Thoroughfare Gap to join the rebel forces. The redeeming of Porter following his court-martial would be detrimental to Pope in the post-war years. He gives him very confusing orders, which you might interpret as do everything but also do nothing, and his attack orders get lost to where it is untenable. Porter, though, stalls, and his stalling would deter an August 29th attack on the Union flank, as it was left open. This is definitely part of the problem, right? In that Porter is saying, hey, there's guys here, right? You also have a John Fulton Reynolds, who is going to also give a very similar intelligence to Pope, who's saying, hey, there's Confederates in front of me, and Pope is essentially going to call him a young man, an excitable young man, essentially. Those actually might be his exact words, and just completely dismiss what the situation on the ground, right? We've talked about this before, how if you're going to be a leader, you need to be able to adapt to the situation that is on the ground, understand how it is unfolding, and Pope is just really not able to do that. And obviously, either he doesn't want to come to the realization that Longstreet is arriving, or he just doesn't want to believe it, right? Longstreet would have a half-hearted attack at dusk that would at least announce the presence of his command, and this was only after McDowell pulls his troops to Henry House Hill. McDowell does deserve some blame for really not acting on the situation, but really Pope again is not getting the big picture. He's still unaware that Longstreet is on the field, and then again, he's more concerned about where he thinks the right flank of the Confederate army is. Combat on this scale is definitely outside of his depth, and you could think maybe he is more like McClellan, who shows a very linear way of thinking. But, on the other side, and then in the defense of Little Mac, at least he's sort of acting off what he believes to be actionable intelligence most of the time, whereas Pope is really only operating off of the Confederates are in front of us. Renewed assaults, including Porter's 5th Corps, would fail yet again on Jackson's line, which will open up the ability of Longstreet to launch a flank attack. Heavy fighting on Chinn Ridge and then again on Henry House Hill, with elements of the 9th Corps arriving, is going to stave the army from complete disaster. In fact, had Jackson's entire corps not been fighting for 3 days, and had they not seen a large loss in officers, then they might have been able to drive home the victory. And this is something else that we should also point out, in that Second Manassas, especially on the fight at the railroad cut, it is actually a close run thing. It's not to say that Pope is getting thrashed, right? He's not necessarily losing there in the middle of this battle. He is definitely taking a toll on the Confederates, so we cannot necessarily dock him for that. But certainly he is not doing himself any favors and not taking an advantage of really anything in terms of how, again, intelligence on the ground, right? How are things rolling out? Pope still does not really know what to do. An engagement at Chantilly, and then his cashiering out of the army, sending to deal with the crisis, I say in quotations, out of Minnesota, being what happens next for him. There will be mixed feelings on Pope surrounding the armies after Second Manassas. We have 2 quotes that illustrate this. Between Halleck, McClellan, and Pope, the only one who had fought like a soldier and maneuvered like a general was sent to the northwestern frontier to watch Indian tribes, carrying the burden of the others' sins into the wilderness. Mr. Lincoln's sacrifice of his sense of justice to what seemed to be the only expedient in the terrible crisis was sublime. McClellan commanded the army, and Porter and Franklin each commanded a corps. If the country was to be saved, confidence and power could not be bestowed by halves. This would be Jacob Cox giving this account here. Obviously, Jacob Cox is going to be a Republican. He's going to be a political ally, right? So he's obviously going to have this opinion. He's not going to be a big fan of McClellan either. So he's giving us his Pope opinion, right? But obviously there were those who were pro-Pope, right? But here's another quote that we have here. The general conviction here is that Pope is a failure. And there is a belief and admission that he has not been seconded and sustained as he should have been by McClellan, Franklin, Fitzporter, and perhaps some others. Personal jealousies and professional rivalries. The band and curse of all the armies have entered deeply into ours. Gideon Welles in August of 1862. So here's another one of, Pope is going to be a failure, right? And that's kind of the overall feeling of it, but it's not necessarily his fault all the way, right? And this is what we were talking about here at the top of the episode. There are those who could be the scapegoat. We often don't look too much at McClellan for not getting the troops into position for Pope. And there are those who kind of waffle back and forth for him. There are those who really point to the fact that McClellan does want there to be a victory here. He's not necessarily doing it to hamstring Pope, but he's also not necessarily acting really fast, right? Either. So it's kind of hard to say. So I've seen it both sides, depending on what source you're reading. But he does eventually get some troops to him, right? Most of the Army of the Potomac gets up there, right? And obviously, Fitzjohn Porter, we know what happens to him, right? And obviously, he probably very unfairly gets court-martialed and he gets exonerated at the end of the day. So if that's really the one guy who you're going to really point to and be like, hey, it's his fault I lost, and you could say, if we go back to the example of Joe Hooker, and I have these three guys, right? And Howard, maybe it's not so much Howard, but it's the 11th Corps. We all don't like the 11th Corps, right? It's full of a bunch of Germans. And then we have George Stoneman. Right? Nobody really likes George Stoneman. He hasn't done a really good job. And then you have another general who ends up not surviving the war, conveniently enough, right? So then you have three different guys who are going to be the guys that failed for me. And you can actually point to real things that happened to them and parts of the plan that kind of unraveled, and it doesn't really matter how complicated that plan was. Then you have a better case for yourself versus a guy like Porter here. Burnside's tenure as Army commander would begin with reluctance. He would wish not to take command of the Army as he was very loyal to his benefactor George B. McClellan, who again was cast aside. However, he hated Joe Hooker, who had been given the opportunity should he decline. Burnside's plan was not a bad one, much in the same way Pope's plan had been fairly solid. Following Antietam and the overlooked Loudon Valley campaign, the armies were relatively where they had been before Second Manassas. Burnside would wish for a quick move to Fredericksburg over the Rappahannock and then push south. He stole a march on Lee, but logistical errors would leave his army on the north side of the river. Lee actually anticipated that he would have to pull further south and mount a defense of Richmond elsewhere. With both armies at Fredericksburg, Burnside would wish for an alternative option. He's going to be pressured by Halleck and Lincoln to do something. Both were eager for some kind of action. It had been originally thought that perhaps Lee could be flanked. However, he had shifted some troops to meet this threat on his extreme right. This would show an opportunity for perhaps a frontal assault, not only at the town of Fredericksburg, but also on the Confederate center right, commanded by Jackson, what was going to become known as the Prospect Hill region. It is also assumed that the way the Confederate Army is deployed, then there could be exploitation between the two sectors as they were relatively separated. The plan would be to cross the river, hit the center right where Jackson was, and then maybe a diversionary attack to drive home the assault at the center left at the town of Fredericksburg. We're actually going to redo Fredericksburg here in the future, so we will talk about it, but we will talk about the plan for the battle, and it's not necessarily a bad one, but it does have one big problem, and that there's two parts to this plan. The first part is Prospect Hill has to work, right? You have to break through that piece, and then there is the ridge line beyond that the Confederates have set up defensively. You could potentially roll that up, right? So if you have your wing commander, if you have Franklin as your wing commander who's attacking that, if he pushes on the Confederates there, if he is successful, and you have your command who is attacking through the town there at the Marie's Heights area, you could potentially pin the Confederates there and have your attacking column in the Prospect Hill region then roll them up. And it's not necessarily a bad idea. But as we will see, the big problem is Prospect Hill has to work. Otherwise, there is no plan. The attacks were considered to be of moderate risk, as the massive amount of artillery on the Union side of the river would mitigate the ability of Lee for a direct counterattack. A dark mark on the operations prior to the main battle would be shelling of the town of Fredericksburg, but also understandable if you were trying to establish a foothold on that side of the river. Union forces would cross and push the smaller rebel units out of the abandoned town before general looting. What exactly this says about Burnside is questionable, but perhaps we can take into account the low morale that the Army of the Potomac starts to see. While Pope was more in your face about things, which affects morale, Burnside is going to be hands off. We can also understand that the Army is sort of having this crisis, right? They've been beaten in a lot of these battles. Even Antietam, like, you're saying, did we lose that battle? right? Certainly the Confederate forces are saying, hey, we actually won that one. And, I don't personally don't think that it's a Confederate victory. I sort of chalk it up as a Union victory, but at least at the time, a lot of the Confederates were saying, hey, we actually won that battle. But obviously there were a lot of casualties there. And there were a lot of casualties in a lot of the campaigns already so far. And you are still having to campaign, and it's the winter, and you really want to settle into winter quarters. But you have Burnside, seemingly, is the one who is making you campaign. And you don't know that Lincoln and Halleck and Stanton are the ones who are pressuring him to do something, to actually act, and not settle into winter quarters. So you don't necessarily know that, but obviously it's going to affect morale. December 13th would see the battle commence in earnest. The attacks on Prospect Hill are going to be almost successful. It is the timely arrival of Jubal Early who is going to stave off the federal attacks in the morning. There is an argument that having failed, then the attacks on the center left should have been called off. However, any shift to meet the threat in the center right would have weakened this position. This is also part of the problem, right? There's actually an argument that you could claim that there are very similar instances between Pope and Burnside and their major battles that they preside over, right? And one of them is they get let down by individuals. You get let down by McDowell at 2nd Manassas. He's not the one who is standing up for Porter. He's not the one who's putting his foot down and saying, hey, going to his commanding officer and saying, this is the situation on the ground. I need to let you know so that you are able to make a decision, right? Well, Franklin is not going to do a very good job of communicating to Burnside. He is going to kind of have his orders, and they're going to also be worded kind of strangely. And he's going to essentially think that he has discretion to sort of decide whether he can call off these attacks. And he does. And that's kind of the strange thing about the timeline of Fredericksburg, is that the attacks at Prospect Hill end before the attacks at Marye's Height even begin. So already the plan is sort of over. It's foiled. And so you have this tremendous loss of life at the stone wall at Marye's Heights, and you really didn't need to have it. A series of ineffectual attacks would be launched against the base of the hill, rebel troops taking shelter behind a stone wall. The assault would fail, with heavy casualties, but Burnside would wish to continue along the same lines. He would order a renewal of the attacks on the rebel right, and then throw more troops into the center left. The order to continue would be ignored by William B. Franklin, commanding in the area. We can very fairly question why exactly Burnside decided to continue. Well, there could be a variety of factors. It is not outside the realm of possibility. If both attacks jump off, then maybe there is enough pressure to break the Confederate lines. We can also imagine that having launched these attacks, that saw the many Union troops killed and wounded, that something to show for the loss would have been on the mind of Burnside. You could justify that if you were able to take Marye's Heights or break the army in two at Prospect Hill, then you would at least have something to show for it. With only attacks at Marye's Heights undertaken, then Fredericksburg is going to be a Union defeat. In one day of fighting, Burnside had lost almost as many casualties as the Battle of 2nd Manassas, which was 3 days. He would continue in Army command, though, still being pressured to do something. Thus, we're going to have the Mud March, which sucks the last remaining morale out of the Army of the Potomac following their defeat. In the meantime, Ambrose is trying desperately to resign, and eventually this is going to be accepted, and Hooker will rise to Army command. A major difference in Pope and Burnside is going to be the likability of the two. While that might not seem to matter in the contemporary sense, I believe it very much does. See the Gideon Wells quote that we read earlier. Here's a quote on Burnside. He had naturally a swaggering way, which caused all such affections to set gracefully upon him. He was, besides, a handsome fellow, with a personality that attracted attention upon all occasions. And his rollicking offhand effrontery carried him through with applause, where one of less assurance would have been a mere figurehead. His manly proportions and devilish make-airishness were attractive to women, and aroused in them that admiration for masculine qualities so natural to the female sex. Always jolly and willing, he was an ideal companion among men. His rollicking songs and jovial stories awakened the dullest to rapture. Free and easy in manner, and with but little regard for nicer conventionalities of society, he floated along, light-hearted and gay, upon the flood tide of enjoyment, seemingly regardless of what the ebb might have in store for him. The very abandon with which he threw himself into whatever was going on exercised a captivating influence, and caused him to be sought as one who could always be relied on to give ammunition in any occasion. There was no one like Burnside. For Burnside's non-army commanding career, we have Antietam and his bridge, where often he is wrongly accused of incompetence. He has a tough task that is compounded there, being no emphasis on this part of the field. He does not sparkle at Knoxville, sort of allowing himself to be boxed in, and then he is criticized of making it seem like the situation was more dire than it was. He does have a greener command compared to Longstreet, and his supplies do run low, but Sherman is going to conclude that he is living lavishly. There is generally a lot of confusion during the Wilderness and Spotsylvania battles, so his lack of breaking the Confederate center at the former, and then lack of holding down the rebel line at the latter, can be excused in my opinion. Not a lot of generals are going to look great for the Union in these two engagements, but that is just my opinion. Maybe Emory Upton and Winfield Scott Hancock, if we are naming names. The crater is another tick against him. Is the execution flawed? Yeah. Does he receive the right support from George Meade? No. In fact, it's really more on Meade than anything that the attack is not successful, because he does not throw any troops anywhere else into the fighting, allowing for the Confederates to respond and then eliminate the threat. Pressure elsewhere along the line might have seen more success. So for the good stuff, including his action along the coast of North Carolina, we have some bad stuff too, or at least things that can be classified as going against the grain for success of the general. But what are the final conclusions that we can make here before we wrap up for today about Pope and Burnside? Well, hopefully, since we have now gone over very briefly their 10 years in Army Command in the East, we can actually see that the battles roll out fairly similarly. We have major conflicts, both against Robert E. Lee, where the plan is actually not a bad one, but there's some sort of flaw in the execution. Communication is a problem in both cases. There is somebody who maybe could be blamed, but obviously we cannot put all the blame on one person. It is not McDowell's fault. It is not Porter's fault. It is not Franklin's fault. Ultimately, the fault needs to be in the one who is at the helm, right? But again, there are going to be communication issues with both of them. A difference is going to be experience and likability, as we mentioned as well. Burnside definitely has the advantage in both, right? More people are going to like Burnside. He is more of a personality. There are a lot of people who talk about Pope and how they don't like him, right? He rubs people the wrong way. He's not politically aligned with a lot of them, especially in the army that he takes over. A lot of them are more like McClellan. Burnside is going to definitely be more of a soldier, right? He's more of a guy's guy, as we talked about in that quote. So he's going to get along with people. He had already had a lot of successful actions. We even talked about First Manassas as well. So we had him with that experience. And Pope really hasn't seen combat quite to the same degree as Burnside. So obviously he's at a deficiency there. I'm going to go ahead and put a pause on it for today. Hopefully, I've actually rolled out for you enough for you to make your own decision between Pope and Burnside, whether you believe that their monikers that they received, being the quote-unquote worst generals or bad generals for the army in the East, are warranted or unwarranted, who is the preferable option between the two. We'll talk about that here in the next sub-episode. Hopefully we have a better understanding of both and some of the decisions that they make. Next week we continue our analysis series as we look at two more unsung heroes who are not without their own controversies. We're going to talk about James Longstreet and William Stark Rosecrans. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to his website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.